For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The room fell into a tense quiet after the announcement of the challenge. Warriors filtered out, some murmuring in excitement about the impending fight, leaving only Liam and Libby standing in the now empty medical bay. The air between them felt thick with unspoken tension, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Liam folded his arms and leaned back against the counter, his jaw clenched. "Do you even hear yourself, Libby? You can't just go around claiming people like some sort of prize." Libby turned to face him, her eyes blazing, the smirk on her lips gone now. "This isn't about you being a prize, Liam. It's about respect." "Respect?" He barked a laugh, incredulous. "You think I feel respected when you march in here, declaring I'm yours, like I don't have a say in the matter?" Her hands twitched at her sides, the only sign that his words had struck a nerve. "You don't understand how things work here." "You're right, I don't," Liam shot back, stepping closer to her, his voice rising. "Because back where I come from, people don't treat others like property. You think protecting me is some grand gesture, but all it does is make me feel trapped." Libby's expression softened just a fraction, and for a moment, she looked less like the fierce warrior who commanded entire fleets and more like someone struggling to explain something deeply personal. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "You think I'm doing this to cage you?" "That's exactly what it feels like," he said, though his tone was quieter now. Her nearness made it harder to hold on to his anger, especially when her piercing blue eyes seemed to strip away all his defenses. Libby took another step, close enough now that Liam could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. "I don't care what anyone else thinks, Liam. I don't care about titles or traditions. This isn't about owning you, it's about protecting what's mine." "And what makes me yours?" he challenged, his voice soft but firm, his heart pounding in his chest. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but she hesitated, the vulnerability in her gaze catching Liam off guard. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Because I've never wanted anyone as much as I want you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he could only stare at her, stunned into silence. He had expected arrogance, perhaps even a dismissive quip, but not this, not honesty, not raw emotion. He shook his head, breaking the moment. "Libby, you don't even know me." "I know enough," she said, her voice growing steadier, more confident. "I know you're strong enough to stand up to me when no one else would dare. I know your touch can heal wounds even our best medics can't. And I know that every time someone looks at you, I feel like I could tear the ship apart." Her confession hung in the air between them, heavy and electric. Liam wanted to stay angry, wanted to push back against her possessiveness, but her words made his heart stutter in a way that scared him. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, searching for anything to say that would break the tension. "Libby, you can't just go around threatening people because they look at me. That's not normal." She tilted her head, her white hair spilling over one shoulder. "Do you want me to stop?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he couldn't answer. Did he want her to stop? The logical part of him screamed yes, but another part, a part he barely understood, felt a strange thrill at her possessiveness. It wasn't just her strength or her beauty that drew him in. It was the way she looked at him, like he was the only thing in the galaxy that mattered. "I don't need you to fight my battles," he said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction he wanted it to have. Libby stepped even closer, until there was barely a breath of space between them. "I know you don't need me to, but I'll fight them anyway." "Why?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, in a touch that was surprisingly gentle for someone so fierce. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time, Liam saw something more than fire in her gaze. He saw fear. Not fear of losing the fight, but fear of losing him. "Because no one touches the human but me," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that went beyond the words themselves. Liam swallowed hard, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He wanted to push her away, to tell her she was wrong, but he also wanted to pull her closer, to let himself drown in the intensity of her gaze, her touch, her presence. Before he could decide what to do, the ship's intercom crackled to life, announcing the time and location of the duel. Libby's gaze hardened, the vulnerable moment vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. She stepped back, the fierce warrior returning in full force. "Stay here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm not a child, Libby," he said, his frustration returning. "You can't just tell me what to do." Her lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "You'll understand soon enough." And with that, she turned and strode out of the room, leaving Liam standing there, his heart pounding and his mind racing. He wanted to be angry with her, to reject her possessiveness. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. All he knew was that the coming fight wasn't just about who would claim him. It was about something far more dangerous, something he wasn't ready to face. The arena was a vast, circular pit located in the belly of the Erethis. Its walls were scarred from countless battles, and the air hummed with anticipation as the crew packed the viewing balconies. Warriors of all ranks, some armed, others barehanded, leaned over the rails, shouting bets and jeering taunts at one another. At the center of it all stood Libby and Tarek. Libby was poised, calm, and lethal. She wore a fitted combat uniform that highlighted her athletic form, her white hair braided back to keep it out of her face. Across from her, Tarek loomed like a mountain, his scars glinting under the harsh arena lights. In his hands, he wielded a massive blade, its jagged edge humming with kinetic energy. Liam had ignored Libby's order to stay put. Standing at the edge of the pit, tucked away among the crowd, he watched with a mixture of frustration and unease. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Libby, even as he mentally berated himself for being here at all. This fight was about him, and yet he had no control over it. His very existence on this ship had spiraled into a game of power, dominance, and dangerous emotions. The loud clang of the arena gates shutting snapped Liam back to the present. A low rhythmic chant started among the crew as the duel began. Libby and Tarek circled each other like predators, their eyes locked. "This is unnecessary," Libby called out, her voice carrying over the noise. "We both know how this ends." Tarek grinned, his teeth sharp and predatory. "You've gotten soft, Libby. Too distracted by your pet human to see how far you've fallen." Her expression didn't waver. "Funny, I don't see you stepping forward with any claim of your own. Maybe it's not me who's weak." The crowd erupted into laughter at her jab, and Tarek's grin twisted into a snarl. He charged, his blade raised high. The clash was immediate and brutal. Tarek's blade came down with enough force to split the ground, but Libby moved like liquid fire, sidestepping his attack and countering with a kick to his midsection. The blow sent him staggering back, but only for a moment. He recovered quickly, launching a flurry of strikes that forced Libby to stay on the defensive. Liam gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every time Tarek's blade came close to connecting, his heart leapt into his throat. He had never seen Libby fight like this before. Her movements were calculated, precise, but also terrifyingly fast. It was like watching a storm contained within a single body. Libby ducked under another swing and retaliated with a strike of her own, her fist connecting with Tarek's jaw. The force of the blow sent him stumbling, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. She didn't let up, pressing the advantage with a series of rapid strikes that had the crowd roaring in approval. But Tarek wasn't finished. He roared and swung his blade in a wide arc, forcing Libby to leap back. She landed lightly, but Liam could see the faint sheen of sweat on her skin. Tarek was stronger than any opponent she'd faced recently, and the strain was beginning to show. From his vantage point, Liam couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Libby, watch his left," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Her eyes flicked to him for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, Tarek lunged. His blade grazed her side, tearing through her uniform and leaving a thin, bleeding line along her ribs. The crowd gasped, and Liam's heart sank. Libby staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, her expression darkening. "Big mistake," she growled. The shift in her demeanor was palpable. Where before she had been measured and strategic, now she was a force of pure, unrelenting fury. She surged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Her strikes came faster and harder, each one landing with bone-crushing force. Tarek tried to defend himself, but it was clear he was overwhelmed. Libby's final blow came in the form of a spinning kick that sent him sprawling to the ground, his blade clattering out of reach. She stood over him, breathing hard, her foot pressed against his chest. The tip of her own blade hovered inches from his throat. "Yield," she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Tarek hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he growled out the words, "I yield." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Libby didn't move right away. She kept her blade where it was, her gaze hard and unforgiving. Then, slowly, she stepped back, letting him scramble to his feet and retreat in disgrace. As the arena gates opened and the crew began to disperse, Liam pushed his way through the crowd, his frustration boiling over. By the time he reached Libby, she was leaning against the wall, dabbing at the wound on her side with a piece of cloth. "Are you insane?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Libby glanced up at him, her usual smirk tugging at her lips despite the blood on her side. "You're welcome." "I didn't ask for this," he shot back, gesturing toward the now empty arena. "I didn't ask for any of it. You don't need to keep throwing yourself into fights because of me." Her smirk faded, replaced by something softer. She straightened, stepping closer to him. "You don't get it, do you? Enlighten me," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Libby's gaze bore into his, intense and unflinching. "This isn't just about you, Liam. It's about what you mean to me. To them," she added, gesturing toward the crowd. "You can't keep doing this, you know, fighting everyone who looks at me. You're not just some healer on this ship. You're the only thing I've ever fought for that felt real." He stared at her, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her voice. "Libby?" Before he could finish, she reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. The touch was gentle, at odds with everything he knew about her. "You're not a prize, Liam. You're a choice. My choice." For a moment, he was speechless, caught between the intensity of her gaze and the warmth of her touch. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders relaxing. She smiled faintly, a glimmer of her usual confidence returning. "Maybe not, but I'll fight anyone who tries to take you away." Liam shook his head, exasperated but unable to suppress the faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're impossible. And you love it," she teased, her grin widening. He rolled his eyes, but his heart betrayed him, pounding in his chest as her words hung between them. Their moment was interrupted by the ship's intercom. "Libby, report to the command deck immediately. Hostile ship detected on the perimeter." Libby's grin faded, replaced by the steely determination he had come to recognize. "Duty calls." As she turned to leave, Liam grabbed her wrist. She looked back at him, surprised. "Be careful," he said softly. Her gaze softened, and she nodded. "Always." And with that, she was gone, leaving Liam alone with the realization that, for better or worse, his life aboard the Erethis was only growing more complicated. The sterile lights of the medical bay hummed softly as Liam carefully cleaned and bandaged the cut along Libby's side. She sat on the examination table, her usual fiery confidence tempered by the quiet intimacy of the moment. The stillness felt foreign to both of them, a fragile truce in the storm that had been raging between them since the day they met. For once, Libby wasn't teasing him or making bold declarations. She watched him work in silence, her blue eyes tracing the sharp angles of his face, the way his jaw tensed as he focused. He was close, so close that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his skin. It unsettled her, this unfamiliar sensation of vulnerability, yet she couldn't bring herself to pull away. "You're lucky this wasn't deeper," Liam said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but tinged with frustration. "A fraction closer to the bone, and you'd be out of commission for weeks." Libby smirked, though it lacked her usual bravado. "You worry too much, and you don't worry enough," he shot back, his tone sharper than he intended. He sighed and set down the cloth, stepping back to put some distance between them. "Why do you do this, Libby? Why put yourself in danger over and over again?" She tilted her head, her white hair slipping over her shoulder. "You know why." "No, I don't," he said, crossing his arms. His blue eyes locked onto hers, unyielding. "You say I'm yours, that you'll fight for me, but you never explain why. Why me? Why does it matter so much to you?" Libby hesitated, her gaze dropping for the briefest of moments before meeting his again. For someone who thrived on confidence, she suddenly looked unsure. "Because you make me feel alive, Liam," she said quietly. "Because when I'm with you, I'm not just a warrior or a commander. I'm me." He blinked, stunned by her admission. "You barely know me." "Maybe," she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "But I know enough to see what no one else does. You're brave, even when you're scared. You stand your ground, even when it's easier to give in. You care more about others than yourself so much that it's maddening sometimes." Her voice softened, her usual edge replaced by something raw and unguarded. "You make me want to protect you, not because you need it, but because I can't bear the thought of losing you." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Liam stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the sincerity in her voice left him speechless. For all her strength and bravado, she was laying herself bare before him, and it shook him to his core. "You don't have to fight for me, Libby," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I'm not some helpless human you need to protect." "I know," she said, her eyes never leaving his. That's why I fight. Because you're not helpless. You're not like anyone I've ever met. You're everything. Liam felt a lump rise in his throat, his carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble under the weight of her words. Libby, I don't know if I can be what you want me to be. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. Her touch was light, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to her usual confidence. I don't want you to be anything other than what you are. He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to where her fingers rested on his skin. Her touch sent a jolt of warmth through him, a sensation he wasn't prepared for. When he looked back up, her eyes were searching his, filled with a depth of emotion that both frightened and exhilarated him. Libby, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. What? She asked, leaning in slightly. Her tone was softer now, almost vulnerable. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking this is crazy, he admitted, his lips quirking into a faint, self-deprecating smile. You're an alien warrior who could probably snap me in half, and I'm just a human healer who got dragged into all of this by accident. None of this makes any sense. Maybe it doesn't, she said, her smile returning. But does it matter? He hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Part of him wanted to push her away, to keep the walls around his heart intact, but another part, deeper, stronger, wanted to let her in, to let himself feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders relaxing as he gave in to the truth he couldn't deny. It doesn't matter. Libby's smile widened, and for the first time since they'd met, Liam saw a softness in her that made his chest ache. She stepped closer, her hand moving from his arm to his cheek, her touch light but firm. You scare me, you know, he said, his voice barely audible. Her brow furrowed slightly, though her gaze remained steady. Why? Because you make me feel things I don't know how to deal with, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. And because I don't want to lose myself in you. You won't, she said, her voice firm but gentle. You're stronger than you think, Liam, and no matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. The words struck a chord deep within him, and before he could second-guess himself, he reached up, his hand covering hers where it rested on his cheek. The touch was simple, but the emotion behind it was anything but. Libby, he said again, his voice trailing off as he searched her gaze. I'm here, she whispered, leaning in just enough for her breath to brush against his skin. I'm always here. In that moment, the walls between them cracked, the unspoken emotions they had both been denying finally spilling over. Neither of them moved closer, yet the air between them felt charged, like the calm before a storm. It wasn't a confession, not entirely, but it was a beginning, a fragile, beautiful beginning. And for now, that was enough. The quiet hum of the Erethis echoed through Libby's quarters, a stark contrast to the roaring tension that had gripped the arena earlier. Liam stood just inside the door, his arms crossed as he leaned against the frame. The dim lighting cast soft shadows on the sleek metallic walls, but his focus was entirely on the woman seated on the edge of her cot. Libby had been silent since they arrived, her usual confidence replaced by a palpable vulnerability. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, the glow of the nearby console catching the silver streaks in her braided hair. The bandage on her side peeked through the torn fabric of her combat suit, a silent reminder of the duel she had fought for him. You could have been killed, Liam said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, laced with equal parts frustration, and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. Libby looked up at him, her piercing blue eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. You think I don't know that? Then why? He pressed, stepping closer. Why put yourself through this for me? You don't owe me anything, Libby. You're not some what? She interrupted, standing abruptly. She closed the distance between them in 2 strides, her presence commanding despite the tender wound at her side. Some human? Some fragile thing that needs saving? Her words hit him like a blow, but before he could respond, she sighed and ran a hand through her hair, her expression softening. You're not fragile, Liam. That's what drives me crazy. You're strong, stubborn, impossible, and it terrifies me. He blinked, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her voice. Terrifies you? She nodded, her gaze locking onto his. Because I've fought wars, Liam. I've faced down armies and walked away without a second thought. But you make me feel things I can't fight, and I don't know how to handle that. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and electric. Liam's heart raced as he stepped closer, his voice soft but unyielding. "You don't have to fight this, Libby." She searched his gaze, her walls crumbling one by one. "And what if I don't want to let go? What if I don't want to share you with anyone?" "Then don't," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His hand moved almost instinctively, brushing against her arm. The contact was light, tentative, but it sent a shiver through both of them. Libby's breath hitched, and for the first time, she looked unsure. "Liam." He stepped closer, his hand trailing down to hers, their fingers brushing in a way that felt both deliberate and accidental. "You don't have to be strong all the time, you know. You don't have to carry this on your own." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she took another step toward him, closing the remaining space between them. The warmth of her body pressed against his, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of their unspoken emotions filling the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You're the only thing I've ever been afraid of losing." Liam's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. "You won't lose me, Libby." Her gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes, and in that moment, the tension between them unraveled. Their lips met in a kiss that was as much a confession as it was a release, a collision of passion, frustration, and everything they had been holding back. Libby's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened. Liam's hands rested on her waist, careful of her injury, but firm enough to anchor her to him. The intensity of the moment consumed them, the rest of the world fading into oblivion. When they finally broke apart, their breaths came in shallow gasps. Libby rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed as she whispered, "You have no idea what you're doing to me." Liam chuckled softly, his fingers brushing against her side in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. "I think I have a pretty good idea." She opened her eyes, a flicker of her usual confidence returning as she smirked. "You're insufferable, and you love it," he teased, his voice warm and low. Libby shook her head, laughing softly. "I don't know what I'm going to do with you." "Start by letting me take care of you for once," he said, his tone turning serious. He guided her back to the cot, his hands gentle but firm as he helped her sit. "You've done enough fighting for one day." She watched him with a mixture of amusement and affection as he grabbed a fresh bandage from the medkit and began tending to her wound again. "You know, this isn't exactly how I imagined tonight going." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Oh? And how did you imagine it?" Libby's smirk widened, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Let's just say it involved a lot less bandaging and a lot more celebrating." Liam laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You're unbelievable. And you're still here," she pointed out, her tone softer now. Her hand reached out, brushing against his arm. "That has to mean something." He paused, meeting her gaze. "It means everything." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their emotions settling between them. Whatever lay ahead, rivalries, battles, or the endless unknown of the galaxy, they would face it together. And for now, that was enough. The lights of the Erethis dimmed to their usual subdued glow as the ship moved through uncharted space. Liam sat on the edge of Libby's cot, his mind still reeling from the intensity of their last encounter. The air between them had shifted in ways he couldn't fully understand, but it was undeniable something deep and irreversible had formed between them. Libby stood at the console near the wall, her sharp blue eyes scanning incoming reports. Even now, dressed in her torn combat suit and with a faint sheen of exhaustion on her skin, she exuded an effortless power that made Liam's chest tighten. He was about to say something, maybe something sarcastic to break the tension, or something honest that would only deepen it when the ship's alarms blared to life. A sharp, mechanical voice filled the room. "Hostile ships detected on approach. All crew to battle stations." Libby's demeanor changed instantly. She spun on her heel, her hand already reaching for the comm panel. "What's the status?" she barked. A panicked voice crackled through the speaker. "2 hostile cruisers, unidentified origin. They've powered weapons and locked onto us. Shields holding for now, but they're closing fast." "Of course they are," Libby muttered under her breath before turning to Liam. "Stay here." He shot to his feet, his frustration flaring. "Oh no, not this again. You don't get to bench me like I'm some fragile vase." Her glare was sharp enough to cut steel. "This isn't a discussion, Liam. They're after us, and if they know you're here, then maybe I can help," he interrupted. "You're not the only one who can handle a little danger." She opened her mouth to argue, but the ship shuddered violently as an explosion rocked its hull. Liam grabbed the edge of the cot to steady himself, while Libby immediately hit the comm panel again. "Return fire," she ordered, her voice like iron. "Target their engines and focus on evasion until I get to the bridge." Another blast shook the ship, and Liam stumbled toward her. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, she sighed, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. "Fine, but if you get yourself killed, I'm bringing you back just to yell at you." "Deal," he said, trying to mask the nervous thrill that coursed through him as she led him down the corridor. The bridge of the Erethis was a whirlwind of chaos. Officers shouted over one another, consoles flickered with warning lights, and the ship's shields groaned under the relentless barrage from the hostile cruisers. Through the viewport, Liam could see the two enemy ships' sleek, black vessels with an almost insectoid design. They darted around the Erethis like predators circling prey. Libby strode onto the bridge like a storm, her presence immediately commanding the attention of the crew. "Status," she demanded. A younger officer turned, his face pale, shields down to 60%. "Their weaponry is unlike anything we've encountered. The officer didn't get to finish. Another blast slammed into the ship, and the lights flickered as sparks rained from a nearby console. Libby swore under her breath and turned to Liam. "Stay close and don't touch anything," she ordered, moving to the tactical station. Her fingers flew across the controls as she analyzed the situation. "They're targeting our engines. If we lose propulsion, they'll board us," Liam finished grimly. Libby's gaze flicked to him, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. She didn't need to say it, she was already thinking it. If the enemy boarded, Liam would be their primary target. His value as a human healer made him more than a prize, it made him a reason to attack. "We won't let it come to that," she said, her voice low but resolute. But even as she spoke, a warning klaxon blared. "Hull breach detected. Enemy boarding parties have entered the lower decks." Libby cursed, slamming her fist against the console. "They're already inside." Liam's stomach sank. "What do we do?" Her jaw tightened, and she turned to the nearest officer. "Lock down the upper decks. Deploy squads to contain them." The officer nodded and relayed the orders, but Libby wasn't finished. She grabbed a blade from a nearby weapons locker and handed it to Liam. "Here, just in case." He stared at the weapon, then at her. "You think I'm going to need this?" "I think I'd rather you have it and not need it," she said, her voice quieter now, then the other way around. Before he could respond, the bridge doors hissed open, and an explosion sent a shockwave through the room. Liam was thrown to the floor, his ears ringing as chaos erupted around him. When he looked up, a group of alien invaders, taller and more insectoid than Libby's kind, poured into the bridge, their weapons glowing with ominous energy. Libby moved before Liam could react. She was a blur of motion, her blade slicing through the air as she engaged the first invader. The clash was brutal and immediate, her movements precise and deadly, but there were too many of them, and the crew was already overwhelmed. Liam scrambled to his feet, gripping the blade Libby had given him. He wasn't a fighter he had spent his life healing, not harming, but he refused to be useless. As one of the invaders lunged toward a fallen officer, Liam stepped forward, his heart pounding. With more instinct than skill, he drove the blade into the creature's side. It let out a guttural screech before collapsing. Adrenaline surged through him, but there was no time to process what he'd just done. Another invader charged toward him, but before it could reach him, Libby appeared, slamming it against the wall with a strength that left Liam in awe. "I told you to stay close," she said, her voice breathless but sharp. "I am close," he shot back, his grip tightening on the blade, "and I'm not leaving you to handle this alone." Her eyes flashed, a mixture of frustration and admiration, but there was no time to argue. More invaders swarmed onto the bridge, and together they fought back, side by side. For every enemy that fell, more seemed to take their place. The air was thick with the sounds of battle blades clashing, energy weapons firing, and the grunts and screams of combat. Liam's muscles ached, and his breaths came in short gasps, but he refused to falter. Libby was a force of nature, her every movement a testament to her skill and determination. Yet even she wasn't invincible. Liam caught a glimpse of one of the invaders raising a weapon behind her, its energy core glowing with lethal intent. "Libby!" he shouted, throwing himself toward her. He tackled her to the ground just as the weapon fired, the blast narrowly missing them. They hit the floor hard, Libby landing on top of him. For a moment, they were both still, their breaths mingling as they stared at each other. Her hair had come loose from its braid, and it framed her face as she looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "You just saved my life," she said softly. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice equally quiet. She smirked, though there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "Don't make a habit of it, human." Before he could respond, another explosion rocked the bridge, and Libby pushed herself to her feet, pulling him up with her. "This isn't over yet," she said, her tone hardening. And as the battle raged on around them, Liam realized something. He wasn't fighting just for survival anymore. He was fighting for her. The dim glow of the Erethis' emergency lighting bathed Libby's quarters in a soft, amber hue. Outside, the ship's systems hummed with the steady rhythm of a vessel in recovery. The battle was over, the invaders repelled, and yet the tension between Libby and Liam had only grown heavier in the quiet aftermath. Liam sat cross-legged on the floor near the center of the room, his back against the wall, bandages hastily wrapped around his shoulder. Libby stood by the small viewport, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the stars. The silence stretched between them, taut and filled with the unspoken weight of everything they had left unsaid. Finally, Liam broke the stillness. "You've been standing there for 10 minutes. Are you going to say something? Or are we just going to pretend that everything's fine?" Libby's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "What do you want me to say, Liam? That I'm sorry? That I regret fighting for you? Because I don't." He sighed, leaning his head back against the wall. "I don't need you to apologize, Libby. I just need you to be honest." She turned then, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "Honest about what?" "About everything," he said, his voice steady but low. "About why you can't seem to let me out of your sight. About why you threw yourself into a fight you didn't have to win. About why you're standing over there like you're afraid to come closer." Libby frowned, the crack in her defenses widening. "I'm not afraid." "Then what is it?" he asked, his tone softening. "Because you're not acting like the Libby I know. The Libby I know would have told me exactly what she's thinking by now." She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her arms still crossed as if she were shielding herself from his words. "You want to know what I'm thinking?" "Yes," he said simply. Her gaze bore into his, and for a moment she hesitated. But then, with a deep breath, she let the walls crumble. "I'm thinking that you scare me, Liam, more than any enemy I've ever faced." He blinked, stunned by her admission. "I scare you?" "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Because every time I look at you, I feel like I'm losing control. And for someone like me, control is everything." He stood slowly, his movements careful, as if he didn't want to startle her. "Libby, losing control doesn't mean losing yourself." "Doesn't it?" she asked, her arms dropping to her sides. "I've spent my entire life fighting, proving myself to people who thought I didn't belong. Letting someone in, it feels like giving up everything I've worked for." "You don't have to give up anything," he said, stepping closer. "You don't have to prove anything to me. I already see you, Libby, all of you." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her fingers tightening into fists. "You don't understand, Liam. If I let you in, if I care too much, what happens if I lose you?" "You won't," he said firmly, reaching out to gently take her hand. "Not unless you push me away." She stared at their joined hands, her expression softening, as her fingers relaxed against his. "You make it sound so simple." "Because it is," he said, stepping even closer. "You don't have to be the strongest person in the room all the time, Libby. You don't have to carry the weight of everything on your shoulders. You can let me carry some of it with you." Her gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time, there was no fire in her eyes, only raw, unguarded emotion. "You're the first person who's ever made me feel this way," she admitted. "Like I'm more than just a warrior. Like I'm enough." "You are enough," he said softly, his voice laced with conviction. "You always have been." The space between them dissolved as he stepped closer, his free hand brushing against her arm. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a shiver through her all the same. Her other hand came up, resting against his chest, and for a moment, they simply stood there, their breaths mingling in the quiet room. "You drive me crazy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You make me feel like I don't know who I am anymore." Liam smiled, his fingers trailing up her arm in a slow, deliberate motion. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." She let out a soft, breathless laugh, her head tilting slightly as she looked up at him. "You're impossible, and yet you're still standing here," he teased, his voice warm and low. Her fingers curled against his chest, and she took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to do this, Liam. I don't know how to let someone in without being afraid." He leaned down, his forehead resting gently against hers. "You don't have to know. Just let it happen. Let me in." For a moment, she closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breath against hers. When she opened them again, the vulnerability in her gaze was matched only by her determination. "No more walls," she said softly. "No more pretending. No more secrets," he agreed. Her lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "You're not going to make this easy on me, are you?" "Never," he said, his own smile widening. Their lips met in a kiss that was slow, tender, and charged with all the emotions they had kept bottled up for so long. It wasn't a collision of passion, but a quiet surrender, an unspoken promise that neither of them had to face the galaxy alone anymore. When they finally pulled apart, Libby rested her forehead against his, her fingers tracing light patterns along his chest. "You're not like anyone I've ever met, Liam." He chuckled softly, his hands resting on her hips. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," she said, her voice growing quieter. "But it's also terrifying." "Good," he said, his tone teasing but gentle, "because I'm pretty terrified of you too." She laughed, the sound warm and unguarded, and for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: peace. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's presence, the stars outside the viewport seemed a little brighter, the weight of the galaxy a little lighter. For Libby and Liam, the battles ahead would be many, but they would face them together with no walls, no secrets, and no fear of what lay ahead. For now, that was enough.